Can you imagine resting comfortably on a transatlantic flight, only to be jolted awake by the sound of panic? The trembling voice of the co-pilot, breaking through the rain and thunder, shaking the cabin. That's where our story begins. The North Atlantic has always been a challenging route, but on this particular night, fate had something far more harrowing in store for the 312 souls aboard the gleaming silver Boeing 747. Outside, one of the fiercest storms ever documented raged, the aircraft fighting for every inch through sheets of rain and winds so strong that even seasoned travelers glanced uneasily at each other with every jolt and pitch. Passengers murmured prayers and clutched armrests, lost in their own oceans of fear. In the midst of this, sleeping quietly in seat 23C, Kesha Washington had not a hint of anticipation for what would soon unfold. For someone who'd spent years on military missions where sleep itself was a luxury, adapting to rest under duress was her specialty. But suddenly, the cabin speakers crackled, and the co-pilot's voice, James Wilson, came alive with near paralyzing desperation. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a serious medical emergency. Captain Mitchell is unconscious, and I need immediate assistance from anyone with combat aviation experience." Kesha's eyes snapped open at once. She scanned the chaos around her, instantly alert. This was not the usual turbulence. This was life on a knife's edge, and her instincts, honed over years in the Air Force, prickled with warning. Meanwhile, in first class, Richard Blackwood, a wealthy businessman, adjusted his bespoke spectacles, muttering derisively about the likelihood of a qualified fighter pilot slumming it in economy. His glance fell over Kesha, relaxed but sharp-eyed, easily dismissed in her practical jeans and simple blouse. The quintessential black woman, whom society too often relegated to the ordinary. What Richard failed to grasp was that fate, in all its indifference, had already placed history's finest pilot right in their midst, disguised as an unremarkable passenger. Subscribe and hit like. Our powerful stories add years to your life. Join our Story Lovers Club and let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? As the aircraft bucked violently, rain beating against the windows, the mood inside began to unravel. Every shriek of wind seemed to pull at the threads of calm, and as passengers began to realize just how dire things were, panic seeped in like a poisonous fog. Children cried, their innocence rocked by the terror in their parents' eyes. Some passengers quietly typed farewell texts, trembling fingers. "And I've never faced anything like this." Kesha looked around, acutely aware that no one considered her. Everywhere she glanced, she saw the same assumption. She was civilian training isn't sufficient for what we're facing. Richard's indignation grew, his ego swelling, even as disaster loomed all around. "I paid $15,000 for these seats. I have more experience than anyone here," he declared, as if privilege conferred expertise. It was then, in the eye of this human storm, that Kesha rose quietly from her seat. Her movements were a study in practiced calm, each step measured, While others flailed, she embodied the precise confidence born of surviving the unimaginable. The aisles seemed endless as Kesha made her way toward the cockpit. Some passengers watched with guarded hope, though just as many stared with thinly veiled skepticism. She ignored them all, focused solely on the task at hand. "Excuse me," Kesha said to the flight attendant, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "Colonel Kesha Washington, United States Air Force. 500 hours of flight time in F-22 Raptors. Specialization in navigation under extreme conditions." The silence that follows her words was colder than the storm outside. Richard Blackwood gawped, mouth agape, staring in disbelief, as if he'd just seen possibility do the impossible. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, unable to reconcile the image before him with the credentials she'd just revealed. But in Kesha's eyes there was a depth, an unflinching confidence formed in the crucible of combat and adversity, a calm and command incomprehensible to those who had only known comfort. Though some remained skeptical, others began to listen, hope battling with old prejudices. Richard's bitter laugh echoed through the cabin. "Colonel, you?" He gestured dismissively, unable to contain his disdain. "I respect the military, but my wife and I didn't pay a fortune to trust our lives to a fantasy." A murmur spread through the passengers. An elderly lady in first class whispered, "Is she really qualified? She looks so young." The subtext hung in the air, stinging with the old pain of doubt. Suddenly, James Wilson burst out from behind the cockpit door, his face ashen. "Please, anyone with military experience, come forward. Captain Mitchell is having seizures. I've never flown solo in conditions like this." His voice broke as the crisis peaked to a crescendo. Richard was relentless, puffing his chest out again. "Young man," he bellowed, "I've flown in private jets all over Europe, 200 hours in the air, even if it's just as a passenger. I know procedures." Kesha said nothing at first, watching the spectacle unfold. Years in the military had taught her that some battles weren't worth fighting. But this was not the place for pride. Lives were at stake. In the young co-pilot's eyes, she saw not arrogance, but genuine terror, a need for leadership, not theatrics. Like a switch, Kesha stepped into her calling. "Mr. Wilson, current altitude, speed, and precise weather conditions, quickly." James rattled off the data almost automatically. Altitude, 38,000 feet. Speed, 450 knots. Crosswinds, 120 to 160 kilometers per hour. His response betrayed the relief of being guided by authority. Richard sneered. "Impressive. She must have just memorized numbers off Wikipedia. That doesn't make her a pilot." That was when Kesha demonstrated her true mettle. Focusing, she calmly began to recite. Emergency procedure for loss of pressurization at cruising altitude. Immediate oxygen masks. Emergency descent to 10,000 feet. Descent angle no more than 15 degrees to preserve structural integrity. Air Traffic Control Code 7700. She went on, listing safety protocols and advanced combat maneuvers, each syllable loaded with experience and intent, speaking for 2 full minutes, until the entire cabin fell silent, except for the thunder outside. James Wilson stared at her, astonished, grateful, and believing for the first time that survival might be possible. "Ma'am, the cockpit is yours." But Richard, tragically, was not done deriding. "Anyone can learn rules. I demand credentials before I entrust my life to someone who doesn't belong in first class." His words cut through the hope, stinging with the barbed edge of ignorance. The other passengers looked away, too embarrassed to support him, but too timid to intervene. For Kesha, the sting of injustice was all too familiar. She'd been doubted, challenged, and sidelined her entire career, her gender and skin color more scrutinized than her medals or mastery. She remembered the first time a white colonel had openly questioned her ability to lead a formation in combat, the time she was denied promotion despite holding the best record, the whispers about quotas that followed her up the ranks. Yet, adversity had refined her iron will. Every doubt fed her determination. Every insult sharpened her focus. Every attempt to undermine her became another reason to excel. She stepped closer to Richard, her voice low, meant for the cabin to hear. "Mr. Blackwood, there are 3 kinds of pilots. Those who fly when it's easy, those who fly when it's hard, and those who fly when it's impossible." Kesha paused at the edge of the cockpit, her stance unwavering. "I have saved 17 aircraft in situations considered irrecoverable. But what qualifies me most isn't medals, it's survival. I am the only person on this plane who has flown through a war zone with 2 engines out, a dead navigation system, and missiles chasing me. And I brought my whole squadron home." She strode into the cockpit, turning one last time to Richard. "When we land, and we will, maybe you'll remember how a black woman, who you thought didn't belong in first class, saved your life and your family." A hush fell over the cabin. From fear and prejudice, a new recognition began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, this extraordinary woman was exactly who the world needed in its darkest hour. Crossing the threshold into the cockpit, Kesha was struck by a scene of chaos and desperation. Dials flashed warning signals in red and amber. Storm clouds battered the tiny windshield, and a trembling, sweat-soaked James Wilson hovered helplessly over the inert form of Captain Mitchell, whose shallow breathing was the only sign of life. Lightning strobed the sky, illuminating Kesha's face with a ghostly determination. Without hesitation, she slid into the left seat, hands gliding over the familiar symphony of switches and controls. She asked rapid-fire questions, assessing the plane's health, tuning out the tempest outside, and zeroing in on what she could command. Her mind, her training, this vessel of hope. "James, throttle back by 5%. Let's reduce that airspeed. Engage autopilot, heading 241, now. I need constant updates on wind shear. Ignore the alarms. Watch for stick shake. We're stabilizing, not running. Got it?" For the boyish co-pilot, it was like drinking from a fire hose. But he followed orders, each small action restoring a fragment of his shattered confidence, his hands moving with renewed purpose. Kesha's mind was a whirlwind, her senses firing as she pictured the 747 schematics, reviewed anti-stall maneuvers, ran mental checklists honed from countless war simulations. Visible to the passengers through the open cockpit door, she was a portrait of relentless focus, a living antidote to chaos. The radio crackled, A distant ATC demanding, Delta 174, do you copy? Your flight path is momentarily lost. State your status immediately. Kesha's voice, steady as bedrock, cut through. This is Colonel Kesha Washington, USAF, assuming command due to incapacitation of primary captain. Co-pilot support available. Aircraft integrity compromised due to weather. Initiating course correction for survival. Over. There was no bravado, no self-doubt, only the audacity of someone who had been forged in the crucible of disaster, commanding not just a jet, but the faith of all on board. With a controlled breath, Kesha turned to James, brief and to the point. Your job is to stay sharp, execute without hesitation, and believe in this plan, even when fear says otherwise. Are you ready? James's eyes shone with a sudden clarity. Yes, ma'am, ready. A flight attendants, still trembling in the galley, received their orders next. Establish a line of communication with passengers. Distribute water and blankets. Monitor for panic, and assist the medically trained volunteer attending to Captain Mitchell. Kesha's leadership was practical, her instructions concrete, built from years of necessity in battle, where there was no luxury of guesswork. Meanwhile, outside the cockpit, passengers watched the drama unfold, whispers rippling through the rows. The tension in the plane was tangible, but something else began to shimmer beneath it. Hope, fragile and flickering, yet unmistakable. Richard, still seething in first class, couldn't ignore the shift. The people around him, spouses, business associates, strangers, now looked with uncertain awe toward the cockpit, their own prejudices warring with the evidence of competence they had just witnessed. In the rear of the plane, a soft-spoken grandmother clasped her granddaughter close, whispering, "We're in good hands, sweetheart, the bravest kind of hands." Every mile forward became an epic struggle, the Boeing 747 inching its way through a maelstrom, piloted by someone too many had discounted, and now desperately needed. As Kesha adjusted the flight path, her mind flickered, unbidden, to memories that had shaped the very core of her resolve. She remembered a night in Syria, the darkness pierced by rocket tracer fire, when her aircraft took damage and alarms wailed in every compartment. Her wingman, a rookie barely old enough to shave, was trailing behind in a machine belching flames. The radio crackled with the sound of panic, every second threatening disaster. Yet, with icy calm, Kesha had talked him down, maneuvering both jets through enemy territory and into the safety of dawn's first light. That experience lived in the set of her jaw now, in the way her hands never trembled, even as the 747 vibrated with storm-fueled turbulence. Drawing on every fiber of her discipline, she reminded herself, no luxury for uncertainty. What she had learned in war zones was invaluable here. Crisis demanded a leader who not only understood fear, but could master it. She didn't look back into the cabin. She didn't need applause or gratitude. Her focus was singular, survival, and every life behind her became a sacred trust she would honor, no matter what hell raged outside these steel walls. The rain hammered. The turbulence threw the jet like a toy. But Kesha, rooted by memory and mission, became the center of calm in this airborne storm. Behind the cockpit, whispers of rumor and disbelief became stories retold in real time. Some passengers exchanged tearful looks, holding hands with strangers. Others clung to faith or quietly mourned the lives they feared were slipping away. Yet, the more time passed without catastrophe, the clearer it became that Kesha's commanding presence and her uncanny ability to anticipate the aircraft's needs were keeping fate itself at bay. In the galley, a nurse worked with 2 flight attendants in a makeshift triage for Captain Mitchell, improvising support while radioing for ground-based medical advice. Kesha's instructions, carried out through the crew, precise and never panicked, gave order where before there had been helplessness. Richard Blackwood, wrestling with his ego, now watched the scene unfold with a storm inside him. Humiliation mixing with something strange and unfamiliar. Admiration. He listened as passengers whispered their gratitude. Even the most skeptical voices were growing quiet. One father and coach, his children wide-eyed and shivering, told his family, "Remember her, kids. Whatever happens, remember who stepped up when it counted." As another violent gust ripped across the fuselage, Kesha gritted her teeth. She allowed herself a single moment of hope. If she could just keep these people in the air until the storm broke, perhaps redemption, for herself and for faith in human worth, was within reach. The cockpit alarms blared anew as the Boeing shuddered, a microburst threatening to hurl it into a death spiral. James's knuckles were white on the yoke, sweat beading on his brow. Kesha glanced at him, her voice even and clear. "Trust your instruments, not your instinct. We fly the plan and don't improvise now. You hold altitude. I'll handle the rest." Her calm was hard-won and infectious. James nodded, focusing on his dials. Engaging the radio, Kesha updated air traffic control. Delta 174, requesting emergency trajectory clearance. Priority landing, any available field within range. Prepare emergency units for medical evac upon touchdown. ATC responded, their own voices strained but compliant. Delta 174, we're tracking you now. Your approach vector is inbound to Gander, Newfoundland, runway 03. Good luck, Colonel. The ground team stands ready. Having wrested the aircraft from the jaws of the storm, Kesha felt the strain in her heartbeat, but never let it translate through her hands. She glanced at the hazy shapes of the passengers in the reflection of her instrument panel, reminding herself of every face, every hope, every future locked in the hull of this battered but defiant machine. Outside, the rain began to ease, just a notch. They were nowhere near out of danger, but for the first time since this ordeal began, daylight threatened the darkness, and survival seemed possible. Inside the cockpit, for a few impossible moments, a strange quietude set in. Outside, the storm still roared, but the violence felt distant, as though a fragile boundary shielded the 747 from the full force of nature's wrath. Kesha used this rare interval not to rest, but to review, exhaustively and methodically, her every option and contingency. She quickly consulted the digital readouts. Fuel levels were sufficient for less than an hour of holding pattern. Hydraulics showed stress, but structural integrity miraculously held. The storm cell, massive, angry, unpredictable, hung to the south of their route, threatening to double back at any sign of deviation. James, go through the emergency landing checklist aloud. Breathe. Steady your tempo. We do this together, she said, her voice both a command and a reassurance. James, eager to prove his worth, complied, reading off each item. His hands no longer shook as violently. Behind the sealed cockpit door, the whispers had faded into anxious silence. Every creak of the fuselage, every intermittent flash of lightning, reminded the passengers that they existed in the merciless space between accident and salvation. Some held hands, some prayed, some simply stared out at the swirling chaos beyond the portholes, searching for a glimpse of dawn. Kesha caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection, a woman shaped by a lifetime of fighting for recognition, now holding the fate of hundreds between her palms. She could not afford doubt. The people behind her didn't need just a skilled pilot. They needed someone who believed, against every odd, that survival was earned through grit and tenacity. She told herself, "You are the wall. You are the lightning rod. Every fear, every hope, every regret belongs to you now." And she embraced it all, letting the burden forge her resolve into diamond clarity. Preparations complete, she looked to James. When the time comes, we commit. No hesitation. When I say down, you trust that I see the window others can't. He nodded, the unspoken contract between warriors sealed. The outcome was still unknown, but now hope fluttered, a small, persistent flame within every heart on board. As turbulence gave way to an uneasy stillness, the intercom crackled. Kesha's calm voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Kesha Washington. I want to speak to you directly, not as a stranger, but as someone fighting for your safety. As of this moment, I am assuming command of this flight. I have navigated aircraft through combat zones far more dangerous than any storm. I will get you home." Her words sliced through fear like sunlight perforating mist. An audible change swept through the aisles. Heads lifted, tears slowed, and the sense of collective helplessness abated, replaced by the fragile cohesion of a group rallying behind a single leader. Richard Blackwood, the man who had doubted her at every turn, looked around and felt the change. He watched as fellow passengers silently nodded their assent, trusting the voice that defied the storm. The reality of his own prejudice gnawed at him. How narrow and small he now seemed beneath the weight of this extraordinary woman's calm. He wiped his palms on his slacks, thinking of his own daughter, and how he'd want her to be met not by obstacles, but by open doors. Flight attendants relayed Kesha's message with purposeful movements, helping frightened flyers to brace for landing, securing loose objects, preparing the medical team for Captain Mitchell's condition. Even young children, long past the brink of tears, now held their toys as if they were medals, reassured by the certainty in Kesha's tone. In seat 28D, an elderly widow silently resolved that if she survived, every birthday candle would be a prayer for this remarkable pilot. In the darkness, hope became tangible, pulsing from row to row, a wave traveling the length of the aisle. But even as fresh courage surged through the cabin, Kesha faced another invisible storm, the storm of self-doubt and memory. She remembered with painful clarity every moment she'd been told no, not because of her skill, but because of her gender or the color of her skin. Every review board that questioned her assertiveness, every superior who wondered if she was too emotional under pressure, every article that praised male counterparts for lesser deeds. Now, as the weight of this new responsibility pressed tight against her chest, there came the quicksilver temptation of fear. What if you fail? What if they were right all along? But then, Kesha remembered the lives depending on her, here and now, and something ancient and unbreakable rose within her. She glanced sidelong at James, seeing his pallor, noting his white-knuckle grip on the yoke. "You're here because you earned this," she told him. But the words were as much for herself. The speakers started to beep out a proximity warning. "Terrain. Pull up. Terrain." Kesha's hands moved instantly, silencing the alarm and adjusting their approach vector. "We will not go down today," she whispered, an oath not just to those behind her, but to every shadow of discouragement she's ever faced. The storm outside might have been made of wind and water, but the greater battle was always against the invisible forces trying to define your limits. And Kesha was not about to let them win. Not tonight, not ever. The only part you'll need is a part that ghost has to come, just a fact of life. The ground crew at Gander, Newfoundland, readied emergency vehicles as Kesha and James prepared for a landing that would challenge every fiber of their training. In the final seconds, as the plane descended from the violence of altitude into the swirling, rain-slicked air above the runway, Kesha's world narrowed to a single objective: bring them home. Flaps full, gear down, set speed at 145 knots, she instructed, her voice steady despite the sweat dripping down her spine. James responded in kind, their teamwork now a synchrony of purpose impossible an hour ago. She toggled the intercom for a final update. "Brace for impact. Heads down. Stay calm." Her final words, soft but unyielding, became the mantra of survival. The runway rose to meet them, illuminated only by emergency vehicles and the wet reflection of the plane's own lights. Each jolt of turbulence was a new test, but Kesha's hands never left the controls. Every muscle, a testament to mastery, grit, and faith. In the main cabin, a collective silence overtook all, a suspense so thick it felt you could grasp it. Richard silently crossed himself. The flight attendants gathered children and reassured panicking parents. Between earth and sky, seconds stretched. The aircraft's wheels touched the tarmac and seemed to skip, slick with rain, before the full weight settled, tires screeching, brakes engaged, engines howling in reverse. A shudder ran through the fuselage. For a terrifying instant, it seemed they might skid into oblivion. But Kesha's anticipation, her impossibly delicate balance between aggression and restraint, kept the nose in line, the jet slowing faster than seemed physically possible. The 747 came to rest, finally, bathed in the blue and red lights of emergency crews, alive after a trial that would have broken the best. For a long, trembling moment, no one in the cabin dared to breathe. Then came a surge, a wave of applause and cries, children sobbing in relief, adults embracing, tears cutting silent rivers down their cheeks. From the cockpit, Kesha allowed herself a tired smile, the first in what felt like years. James slumped back, eyes shining, grateful beyond words. "You did it," he whispered. "No, we did it," Kesha gently corrected. "Everyone on this plane did it. We believed in each other, even when the sky said it was impossible." Rescue crews rushed aboard, tending first to Captain Mitchell, whose condition stabilized thanks to the nurse's quick thinking in the galley. As passengers were escorted off into the dawn's watery light, many paused at the cockpit to thank Kesha, some with words, some with tears, all with reverence. Richard Blackwood hung back until nearly the last, guilt and awe written plainly across his face. He hesitated, then extended his hand. "You taught me something I won't forget," he managed, his voice unsteady. "About courage. And about seeing people for who they really are." Kesha shook his hand, her grip warm but strong. "Be the kind of man who fights for the right things, Mr. Blackwood. That's all any of us can do." Under the rising sun, Kesha walked with the last of the crew out onto the tarmac. She paused, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to breathe. She had done more than land a jet that night. She'd landed, finally, in a place of acceptance, within herself. And for every barrier she'd ever broken, on behalf of those who would someday follow. The dawn cast soft gold across the tarmac as survivors regrouped inside the emergency terminal. People milled quietly, still shaken but now safe, their relief mingling with wonder as they tried to comprehend all they had endured. Kesha moved through the crowd with gentle dignity, stopping to check on Captain Mitchell, who was now conscious and receiving oxygen. He managed a wan smile upon seeing her, gratitude and respect etched in his face. "Not all heroes wear medals," he murmured. Nearby, passengers gathered in small knots, sharing stories with the kind of intensity that only traffic through shared catastrophe can incite. Parents comforted children, seniors compared their first flight horror stories, and even the previously skeptical joined the chorus of voices talking in awe of the woman who had led them out of oblivion. The flight attendants, their nerves spent a moment together, hands clasped, eyes brimming with emotion. In a world used to hiding behind uniforms and procedure, what had broken through that night was something raw and human. Leadership not born of title, but proven in fire. Richard Blackwood lingered near the windows as his family received hugs and shared tears. For the first time, he considered how much he had taken for granted. The certainty of privilege and the invisible armor of his assumptions. Watching Kesha, he saw the true legacy of courage. It dignified everyone in its presence, even those who ached to change. The news crews arrived, hungry for headlines, but Kesha kept her focus on the people, those breathing, grateful, newly connected by their ordeal. By midday, the rescue had become front-page news. In every major city, screens blinked with headlines. Historic moonless storm, jet saved by U.S. Air Force Colonel. Kesha was quickly identified, and journalists scrambled for details, chasing the story with the tenacity reserved for miracles. The terminal transformed into a press conference, microphones thrust forward, cameras rolling. Reporters asked the same questions in different ways, hoping for drama, for soundbites, for a glimpse into the secret of her composure. Kesha, how did you keep hope alive when so much was stacked against you? Colonel Washington, what goes through your mind during those last critical seconds? She answered softly but firmly, her words free of arrogance, but saturated with earned wisdom. Every life on that plane was counting on me. Every decision, every second. I remembered those who had taught me what it means to serve. When you have no choice but to fight for survival, you find parts of yourself you never knew existed. Some journalists pressed further, seeking commentary on diversity, on representation. Kesha offered a smile, a silent rebuke of their need to frame her achievement solely through those lenses. Skill isn't a color. Leadership isn't exclusive. When people believe in each other, extraordinary things happen. James, awestruck, stood back as Kesha became a symbol not only of survival, but of excellence earned, not bestowed. As passengers and crew departed for their final destinations, the legacy of that night began to ripple out through their lives. Richard Blackwood phoned his daughter, recounting the ordeal with humility, urging her to never judge anyone by the surface. Look for who weighs themselves with real courage. Flight attendants received messages from family and friends, their own tales now part of a national conversation about heroism and the unexpected faces it wears. Parents who once feared flying found new metaphors in Kesha's deft command, telling children stories of bravery and resilience carried out not by fantasy heroes, but by real people determined to defy limits. Some passengers quietly sent thank-you notes to Kesha's military base, wanting her superiors to know that her reputation had grown far beyond the ranks. One elderly man promised to organize a scholarship in her name for underprivileged youth who aspired to fly. Kesha herself received letters, some from young women in aviation programs, others from fellow Black service members, and many from complete strangers who saw in her actions hope for a world where skill and character are valued above all else. Her legacy, forged in the crucible of that lightning-split night, carried forward in the lives she touched. Kesha's return to her base was quieter, shorn of fanfare. There, she sat before her small office window, watching a harmless drizzle tap across the glass, introspection welling within. She thought of the nights spent fighting through war zones, the impossible decisions made in split seconds, and the mounting pressure that came with every shattering success. Not every battle had been against storms. Some had been against the slow erosion of faith, the loneliness of trailblazing, and the subtle but enduring weight of carrying expectations her whole life. Yet, this storm, this flight, had awarded her something rare, a genuine sense of arrival, of enoughness. She called her mentor, an elderly captain who'd seen the world change. He listened, pride in his voice. "Kesha, you proved again that the best leaders answer the call, not the critics." Later, she penned a letter to those still struggling in silence. "Don't wait for permission to shine. The world has a habit of underestimating those it cannot understand. You are not called to fit in. You are called to stand out." Her pain, her triumph, her journey, these were lessons not only for herself, but for anyone who dared to dream and to do. Weeks passed. The story faded from the news cycles, but took root in the hearts of those it touched. Kesha was invited to speak at aviation academies and leadership conferences, her story echoing in halls where young women and men of every color and creed gathered to learn about the crucible of command. She always began with the same words: "Courage isn't what you have before the storm. It's what you find inside it." Richard Blackwood, now a quiet champion for diversity, established a foundation to encourage underrepresented youth to pursue careers in aviation. His own lesson etched in memory. James Wilson advanced quickly, fueled by the memory of a night when true leadership saved more than lives. It ignited his faith in possibility. Most of all, Kesha continued to mentor, write, and fly, her life a testament not only to skill, but to the resilience that turns adversity into hope and hope into history. And somewhere above the clouds, whenever the world doubted what could be achieved, someone would recall the night a jet defied the storm and the extraordinary pilot who led it home.